All right, everyone. Phil Travis here, your professor, History 360. This week, the American Revolution. You know, to talk about the origins of the American Revolution, you'd really have to start at least back with the 7 Years' War, and of course, lead on up to the 1760s, in order to really trace the origins. But for practical purposes, in the short term, the most immediate cause of the Revolutionary War. I mean, of course, you've all heard the no taxation without representation. Of course, issues of representation, issues of taxation, issues of British control in the colonies was at the heart of the Revolution. But the specific event that probably most led to the Revolution was the Boston Tea Party, which occurred in December of 1773 when the East India Company, which was a British trading company. The East India Company had a lot of tea surplus that it needed to sell. And if it didn't sell it, it was going to go out of business, basically. And so the British basically gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea sales in the colonies. And the ships were entered harbor in places like Boston, in places like Norfolk, Virginia, in places like Baltimore. And oftentimes they faced a great deal of animosity from the colonists because the colonists did not want to be told what kind of tea that they would drink. The colonists wanted to be able to make that choice. They didn't appreciate the British government exerting a kind of monopoly upon them. And this led to, of course, the Tea Party, in which, in the port of Boston, some half-drunken colonists, some disguised as Native Americans, boarded the East India ships and threw the tea into the harbor. Thomas Hutchison, who was the governor there, ultimately left after the Boston Tea Party, but he had insisted that the tea should be delivered. But this was a huge, huge issue because it cost a lot of money for the struggling British East India Company at the time, and it really angered the Crown. And as a result of it, the Crown passed a series of acts called the Intolerable Acts. They're called the Intolerable Acts for the American Revolutionaries. They're called the Coercive Acts, if you're looking at it from the British standpoint. And these acts were passed in 1774, and they were designed effectively to punish the colonists. One was the Boston Port Act. And the Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonists had paid the debt, the damages, basically, from the destroyed tea. The port of Boston would be closed. There was a second quartering act in which British soldiers would be quartered in the colonies. They would be sent to the colonies to maintain order, and the colonists would have to quarter them and pay for them and house them and that kind of thing. In Massachusetts, local government town meetings were restricted, and the Quebec Act granted to the colony of Quebec. Now, Quebec was originally a French colony, but Quebec was a British colony after the 7 Years' War. The British basically seized all of France's North American possessions after the 7 Years' War. And so the Quebec Act granted all of the territory to the west. So we're talking about territories in New York State, territories in Ohio. Those are the western territories. Granted all of these western claimed territories to the colony of Quebec. So the Intolerable Acts was a way of punishing the colonists. And it was really this sequence of events, the Boston Tea Party to the Intolerable Acts, that really starts the movement towards the Revolution. There will be the First Continental, and then the Second Continental Congress will be called. The Continental Congresses were originally formed to try to find a way to make a peace with King George. And, of course, the decision to actually separate or attempt to separate from England actually doesn't occur again until 1776. The first engagements, though, of the conflict happened well before the Continental Congress had formally made the decision to decide to become an independent country. In fact, over a year before that decision was made, the first engagements occurred. And these were at Lexington and Concord in April April 19th, 1775. Um, what had happened was that after the Intolerable Acts, the governor in Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, was basically given the responsibility of seizing control of the militias. That maintaining law and order meant seizing the arms possessed by the militias, and he would do this first by marching on Concord, which is where they believed these stores of supplies for the Massachusetts militiamen were. And of course, this is when Paul Revere's ride would have been occurring, warning the colonists in Massachusetts, the revolutionaries, that the British were coming. The first engagement was in Lexington. The colonists had assembled on the green. They were highly outnumbered, and they really disbanded, but a shot was fired, and the British engaged the colonists. On the way to Concord, the colonists continually used guerrilla tactics fighting the British. And when we say guerrilla tactics, we mean unconventional style of fighting. They were sniping from the flanks of the British as the British marched down the main way. They were sniping on the British's flanks and hitting them with harassing, hit-and-run attacks. The British were ultimately run back into Boston, and Thomas Gage and his forces were for a while trapped in the area around Boston, despite the fact that the American militiamen, the Massachusetts militiamen fighting, were really a ragtag. They were farmers. They were people who they were not an organized military by any standpoint, but they used unconventional tactics to great advantage against the British. After these first two engagements, there's a period of several months called the so-called Curious War. The Continental Congress theoretically created a standing army. Its general, of course, would be George Washington, and there was a distinct need for a standing army. The first major engagement after the Curious War happened at Bunker Hill. Well, really, it's on Breed's Hill. It was supposed to be Bunker Hill. But and this was a victory for the colonists. Again, the very beginning of the Revolution, the colonists won some, I would say, moral victories. Theoretically, Bunker Hill was a defeat for the colonists, but in a lot of ways, it was a moral victory. What had happened was the British engaged the colonists who were on Breed's Hill and behind a wall, behind defensive stone encampment or a stone wall, and the British went up the hill and charged them and lost some 2,000 soldiers in three waves of assault against this fortified defensive position. And ultimately, the colonists have to flee Breed's Hill, and it's really a win for the British. But the British took it at tremendous cost. And General William Howe, who was there at the time, would, throughout his time as the head of British operations during 1776 through 1778, General William Howe became much more, much less aggressive, less willing to launch that kind of a direct assault because of the severe casualties that they took at Bunker Hill. In the Revolution, you see a combination of unconventional and conventional tactics. During this period of fighting, conventional war meant there were rules of engagement. You fought generally speaking during the good months. You didn't fight during the winter, generally speaking. If you defeated an enemy on battle, oftentimes you would not pursue that enemy. It was a code of conduct. Battles were highly organized, and there were particular rules of engagement. Conventional war in the European sense meant winning battles on the field and taking control of significant geographical areas or cities. This is not the case in the Revolution. The Revolution is not about conventional tactics. It's not about taking cities. The Revolution, in many respects, was an unconventional war. The British were fighting soldiers that sometimes used hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla tactics. Um, they often were frustrated by these styles and the fact that the less organized American soldiers were less eager to meet them face to face on open battlefields if they didn't have to. And so there is this kind of difference between conventional and unconventional warfare at this time period. And very much the British, generals like William Howe, were trained and schooled in conventional European fighting tactics, and we're not used to the unconventional tactics that they're going to find in the Revolution. So the British and the Americans both possess some strengths and weaknesses. So let's look at these real quick. First, the British strengths. Population. There's a lot more people at this time living in Britain than there are in the United States. They have a professional army. They have a highly trained professional army. The British professional army, too, like the uniforms of the British, which would have been polished. The buttons would have been polished on the British uniforms before going into major battles. The British wore these large hats. All of these things had a distinct purpose, and that was intimidation. When a ragtag group of farmer militiamen see the professional British army in front of them in dazzling colors and shining display with guys with huge hats on that make them look much taller and shining bayonets, it really has a tendency to strike the fear into your opponent. The British Army also made use of mercenaries like the Hessians, which were German mercenaries. Also, Native Americans fought with both sides, but Native Americans fought more with the British than they did with the Americans for obvious reasons, because one of the big reasons for the American Revolution as well was Western expansion, which continually placed pressure on the British colonies, because as the colonists moved further and further west, there was increasing war between Native Americans, and before the 7 Years' War with the French. And so Western expansion had been a problem, and of course Native Americans oftentimes aligned with the British because of that cause. There were a significant amount of loyalists in the United States. The revolutionaries were never a majority of the population. There were people on the fence. There were loyalists called Tories, and then there were also revolutionaries who were deeply passionate. But the revolutionaries were probably in the 40 percentile rather than over 50 during much of the war. Of course, there's also African Americans, African American slaves who oftentimes are appealed to by the British as a form of strategy in the Revolution. Of course, also the Navy, supplies, and economics. The British were the masters of the high seas at this time. This is really at the coming height of the British Empire. And so the British had a real control over supplies. They had a global economic system, and they had an incredibly powerful Navy with lots of population and professional soldiers they could use to fight the conflict. Some of the weaknesses for the British are, of course, though, logistics. They are very far from home, and it is a long trip in terms of trading things, in terms of moving things across the sea. It might be a stretch to say that the generals for the British were poor, but they weren't great generals. The British generals, whether it was Cornwallis in the south or whether it was General Howe during the early part of the campaigns that were fought in the northeast, the British generals seemed to have a difficulty adapting to an unconventional and a revolutionary style of warfare. They were far more used to the more contrived, the more formal forms of professional combat that would have been found in Europe. The British were also distracted. Another example another case for the American Revolution, something that facilitated the success of the American revolutionaries, is international events. The British were a global empire, and the Americas only mattered so much to them. The British had tremendous concerns with events in their Indian colonies. They had tremendous concerns with the French as well as also the Spanish navies that they were fighting abroad, and the involvement of other nations, all of which sought to target the British to try to, out of competition, to try to um, bring the British down a little bit. So the British were distracted by quite a layered amount of international conflict, and of course the American Revolution is successful to a large degree because of the international nature of the conflict. Troop treatment was also an issue for the British. There were a lot of there's a lot of poor treatment of men in service by the British, and many men were impressed into service, and that's an issue. You don't always have the most passionate fighters for the British. And geography, of course. Only the Americans would truly understand the geography in which they were fighting. Some of the American advantages, the Americans had good leaders, solid leaders at least. They had great diplomats. Benjamin Franklin's role in helping coerce the French into joining the American revolutionaries was one of the great successes in American diplomatic history. The Americans were fighting a defensive conflict. It's always easier to fight a defensive conflict than it is to fight an aggressive offensive conflict. The Americans were idealistic and they had a cause. They were deeply nationalistic and they had a reason for fighting, so they were passionate and they truly cared about what they were fighting in oftentimes. And of course, they understood the geography. American disadvantages, they were poorly trained and organized, particularly at the outset. Though Baron von Steuben and Lafayette at Marquis de Lafayette at Valley Forge and places did help to sort of drill the American troops and kind of whip them into shape, but it was a development for the American army. There's also supply issues. There's economic issues. There's issues of unity. So there are, your supplies are cut off from Britain. Excuse me. You have an issue of debt and economics and printing paper money. Some areas are loyalist. So these are some of the big issues facing the Americans. July 4th, 1776, of course, the United States declared the Declaration of Independence. Here you see some of the great founding fathers before you, Franklin and Adams, and the Declaration of Independence, of course, Jefferson. It was hardly a locked deal that this was going to succeed. And when this decision was made, the revolutionaries knew that they were doing it with a great chance that they might not live at the end of it. If the revolution failed, they would certainly have died. Much of the revolution, too, was encouraged by the writing of Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Paine, who famously wrote Common Sense, a pamphlet in 1776 that really stirred up sentiment in favor of revolution, that it was common sense for the United States to form a republic and break from England. This is, of course, a famous depiction. Of course, this is after the fact. It's a painting, obviously, and a very romanticized painting. Washington almost certainly was not in the boat like that. But this is a depiction of the famous crossing of the Delaware. And it really speaks to the importance of unconventional war in the American Revolution. This was a sneak attack on Christmas night in 1776, in which Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River late at night and sneak attacked the Hessian mercenaries on the other side, who had been drinking and having a good time over Christmas, and they caught them by surprise and won a major victory. They took something like 800 mercenaries captured, British mercenaries captured. So an example of warfare being fought by the colonist rules rather than the conventional rules of engagement. For really the first 2 years after Concord and Lexington, if you can say that Concord and Lexington and Bunker Hill were slight moral victories for the colonists, by and large, the Revolution was really on its heels for the first 2 years. Washington was completely defeated and run out of New York in what's sometimes called the Battle of New York. The British occupied Manhattan Island. They defeated Washington, or at least forced Washington's retreat off of Long Island. Some scholars have said that William Howe refused to pursue Washington off of Long Island out of the Battle of New York. He very well could have, but Howe was more complacent as a leader. Some have suggested that was the old traditional kind of rules of engagement that he was following. That for some reason Howe was reluctant to pursue the Americans after they retreated. But the Americans were really on their heels. They lost battles up in Quebec. They lost a battle at Fort Ticonderoga. And by 1777, William Howe had occupied the city of Philadelphia. Another component that scholars have said, was this component of kind of an old European style of conventional war, the occupying of cities as a major military gain. In the case of the American Revolution, the occupation of Philadelphia was irrelevant, and in some cases it might have even hurt the British. There was comments made about this that Philadelphia had occupied Howe rather than the other way around. One of the turning points in the war, some have argued the most important turning point, was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. At the early part of the war, in the first couple years of the war, the British strategy was a strategy to cut the colonies in half. They wanted to come down through the Hudson River area and literally cut the Massachusetts and the New York revolutionaries off from their counterparts in places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey and in Northern Virginia. And so they sought to do this, but at Saratoga, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, two American commanders, won an impressive victory over General John Burgoyne on October 17, 1777. And here, too, were some of the examples of the difficulties of the British Army in fighting this unconventional war. John Burgoyne's troops that moved down from Fort Ticonderoga down to where the battle was fought around Saratoga, they had their wives with them. They had huge kind of trunk roads of supplies, and the Americans harassed them on their flanks continually. And you can see from this map, it looks at some of these early battles, Saratoga in New York, and that was a battle. You can see they attempted to come right down the river there, Hudson River area, try to cut the colonies off. It ultimately failed, and as it failed, the French had been making the decision. Scholars have debated if it was the Battle of Saratoga or if it was a preordained decision, and most scholars suggest that the French had decided to enter the war before Saratoga. But nonetheless, the victory at Saratoga, coupled with the French decision to enter the war, was a very, very significant moment in the Revolution. The Revolution became an international conflict, and the French and ultimately the Spanish both were two of the most significant international powers pledged to fight the British. And they began fighting the British, particularly at sea. And this distracted the British, who had greater concerns in their global imperial domains and in their war with Europeans. It distracted them. It caused them to be unable to focus entirely on the American Revolution, which almost certainly the American Revolution would have been hard up to succeed without that international distraction. This is obviously a painting from Valley Forge. This pictures George Washington with Marquis de Lafayette. Of course, the Valley Forge winter, this was when Howe was in Philadelphia. The Valley Forge is just outside of Philadelphia, and the revolutionaries suffered through a very, very harsh winter in the winter of 1777. And this almost led to the fracturing of the revolution. Many Americans went home. There were issues with pay. There was an issue with conscripting the professional army. Many of the people in the service had only signed up for a limited period. But The Americans came out of this actually properly, like with more proper training as soldiers. And it was at Valley Forge that actually you start to see Lafayette and Baron von Steuben begin to do things to really help to drill the American soldiers into a professional army. Of course, there were also battles in the American West. This is a battle depicting the surrender of British and native forces to George Rogers Clark at Vincennes in present-day, well, it's really Indiana. It's actually not Illinois, it's Indiana, as part of a campaign in the American West. West being Mississippi area, Mississippi River. At the end of the conflict, the last few years of the conflict, the British adopted a new strategy. Their strategy in the north of severing the northern revolutionaries failed, and so they thought they would aim at the south. In particularly, they thought this because they thought there were more loyalists in the south, more Tories willing to fight alongside of the British. And so the British land in Savannah and Charleston, and Lord Cornwallis ultimately leads a conquest of Georgia and South Carolina. In many cases during the conquest, they completely disregarded the loyalists that they were supposed to be aligning with. And much of the information was provided by Benedict Arnold, who, of course, had infamously turned sides in the conflict for money and personal advancement. Ultimately, this is another example of conventional warfare. Individuals like Nathaniel Greene, the fighting Quaker, led guerrilla bands that fought the British as they moved through the South, and they won major victories at places like Cowpens and Kings Mountains. They really were just frustrating General Cornwallis, and eventually Cornwallis had to move into Virginia towards Yorktown, where he took Williamsburg and then stationed himself in Yorktown, waiting for supplies from his navy, Admiral Clinton. This, of course, led to the Battle of Yorktown, in which, for a moment, for a short period of time, the French had seized control of the seas from the British. Basically, the French, Admiral de Grasse of the French, were able to beat the British to the resupply point and were able to blockade Yorktown from the sea. This left the British forces vulnerable to a now much more professionalized American and French army, who then descended around Yorktown and ultimately defeated Cornwallis, as you see the surrender depicted there on October 19th, 1781. Rochambeau was the leader of the French on the ground. The United States, led by George Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse, literally fought an international U.S. and French battle against the British at Yorktown in succeeding this in sealing this victory. After Yorktown, though, the war really wasn't over. There were still over 20,000 troops that were stationed in England. King George III had been pressing to want to fight more, and it was very much down to Washington to keep his military together, to maintain his conventional professional army, to prevent the British from attempting to reignite the war. And of course, the Treaty of Paris was an incredibly successful treaty for the colonists. The United States got this treaty to a large degree because we were working with the French, and the French had tried to use the treaty as a way of limiting the size of the United States, more to a scale of what you saw after the proclamation of 1763. But the British were really eager to prevent the French from monopolizing their influence in North America. And so the British and the United States worked behind the back of the French and secured a very, very beneficial treaty that effectively awarded the American revolutionaries with everything east of the Mississippi minus Florida and Louisiana. Well, Louisiana's west of the Mississippi, but you know what I mean. So there you have it. The American Revolution was really an unconventional revolution. I mean, most revolutions are unconventional, but it was a conflict that involved a significant usage of unconventional warfare by the American Revolution, by the American revolutionaries, by the American patriots. And this, coupled with a more conventional naval international conflict, and international support for the American conflict, both at sea and both on land, was truly decisive in allowing the revolution to succeed. All right, guys, I hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week.